In this lesson, we'll begin blocking out the basic shape of the handle and explore how the Turbo Smooth modifier works. Alright, so to get started, let's go ahead and go to our front view by hitting F on the keyboard. And we're going to go to our Create Panel, Geometry, Standard Primitives, and then Box. And let's just left click and drag out a rectangle about this size here. You don't have to be exact at this point. And then we can come in and we can just start to type in some values. So I'm going to go to 40 on my length. Let's do 200 on our width. And then on our height, we can just set that to 20. We can get that to be a little bit different here later on. Now, let's go ahead and start to create some segments for our object, but before we do that, let's change the color of the object to something a little bit easier to see. So we're going to go to black, and then we'll go to our materials, and we have our previs material that we've set up, and we're going to assign that to our object. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and start to create some segments on our object to begin blocking out the basic shape. So just to get started, let's go ahead and use our keyboard shortcuts, and we're going to use the Swift Loop tool to add some segments in. Now there are different ways of adding segments to an object. You can use connect, you can use cut, you could use the slice plane. All of these we've learned about so far, but I just want to use Swift Loop just to make it go very quickly and also get in the hang of using our keyboard shortcuts. So with our box selected, let's hit Control, Shift, and S, but you'll notice that the Swift Loop tool is not coming up. And there's a very good reason on why it's not coming up. You have to remember that the Swift Loop tool can only be used on editable geometry. If we go to our Modify panel, you'll see that this is still a box, and so we need to convert it to an editable poly. So we can do this by right-clicking, going to our quad menu, and hitting Convert to Editable Poly. Now if we hit Control-Shift-S with this object selected, we now have our Swift Loop tool. So now I can come in and just start to create some cuts along the length of our handle here, and I'm going to cut two segments, and they're going to be about the same width from one another at each end relatively. And then I'm going to create two cuts here in the middle like so, and then one to split that. So our polygons should be fairly close to being the same. If they're not exactly the same, it's not a big issue, because we know that as we begin modeling and starting to build up the different shapes of our model, these vertices are going to change position. So we don't have to get them perfect to start out. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to block out the main shape that we're looking for. So I'm going to go to vertex mode, and I'm going to select this vertex on the end. I'm going to pull that back, and then I'm going to take this one and pull it straight down. So we start to get this little lip along the bottom of the handle of the machete that we're creating. So we have this shape here, and we want to take these three vertices, and I'm going to pull those down just a little bit, and then the middle one down just a little bit further, just to kind of give us this rounded shape that's going to go into. Alright, so I'm happy with the way that that's looking so far. So now what I want to do is I want to show you the Turbo Smooth modifier and what it does exactly. Now you may have explored or experimented with this modifier up to this point, and you may have seen what it does on the superficial level, but let's talk about how it actually works. So we have our modifier sets already up here, so all I have to do is click on Turbo Smooth, and you'll see that it smooths out my geometry. Now we've got a pretty smooth result, smoother than what we had, but it's still very angular and faceted. So under our Turbo Smooth modifier, if we scroll down in our panel here, you'll notice here that we have the main parameters and we have our iterations, and right now this is set to 1. If we bump this up, you'll notice that we add more segments and it subdivides itself and it becomes smoother. We can continue to do this until it becomes very, very smooth. Now I would suggest not going up above 3 iterations on anything that you create, because if you go up any higher, it's just really a waste of polygons, and it can ultimately make 3ds Max freeze, and you could lose some work. So you want to be very careful of doing that. I'm going to drop this down to 2 because this is where we want to stick around for most of the time whenever we're working. We might even drop that down to 1 once we start to add enough geometry to create our shape. Now, in the main parameters, there are a couple of other options that we have available to us. We have our render iterations. And what we can do is we can keep our iterations set to 0 and continue to work on it that way. And then whenever we render, it will show our turbo smooth iteration. So let's take this to 2 and then hit render, and you'll see that that looks smoothed, even though we're not working that way in the viewport. This could be a really helpful technique for you if your computer is not able to handle the turbo smooth modifier, especially in larger scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off in this case, as I want to be able to see this in my view. Now the next option that we have is isoline display, and isoline display is going to be really helpful because it can get rid of the extra geometry that it creates and only show you the original cage or control loops in your object. So these are the original splines or edges that we have in our model, but it rounds those out, and it rounds those out depending on the amount of segments that it's been put in. So if I take this down to 1, you'll see that they get a little more jagged, but if I take that up, those lines become smoother. And the reason for that is if we turn off isoline display is it has more segments. It does not mean that it gets rid of all those segments. It doesn't mean that you don't have all those polygons on the screen. It's just a display. Okay, so let's take that back down to 2. Now under our surface parameters, we have some other properties which we will talk about later, especially once we start getting into smoothing out different segments of the machete that we're creating here. So that should be enough for now on the turbo smooth modifier. Now in the next lesson, what we want to do is we want to take a look at how to get the volume back that we've lost. If you'll take a look at this, if we turn off our turbo smooth, okay, just by hitting that, turning it off, you'll see that this was the volume we were going for. But whenever turbo smooth is applied, you'll notice that we lose that top corner there. And what we need to do is we need to learn how to create control loops, which will help us to retain that volume. And we'll start in that next.